Welcome to this afternoon's session, and we feel very lucky to have not only the Minister of State for Employment, but also John Hayes from Education and Skills, and Mr Walsh, perhaps you'd like to just tell us your role.
Yes, I'm in Walsh, Department for Work and Pensions, and I head up something called the Labour Market Intervention Strategy Division, dealing with moving people on DWP benefits into work.
Well, we're, as you know, looking at the youth contract and youth unemployment, and we feel that this mixture of witnesses at ministerial level should be very helpful to us. Our chairman, Anne Begg, is much recovered, but not quite yet back to full health, but she will be in September, so she's asked me to chair it today. Can I just start by asking some questions about preparing young people for employment and what schools should be doing? I mean, many witnesses, the CBI and others, have given us the impression that careers advice isn't as good as it should be, and that young people are not coming through with quite the right attitude for the workplace. In other words, that there's a bit of a mismatch between what's going on and what's needed. I don't know if...
Work on careers, John, why don't you start?
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think that's true. I think historically there has been a problem with careers advice and guidance in two respects. Firstly, that the responsibility schools have is, of course, to provide advice and guidance, but it's clear from various bits of survey information that schools typically didn't give people the full range of options because they weren't equipped to do so. I think there was one survey for Edge which found that teachers knew less about apprenticeships than any other qualification apart from the Welsh Baccalaureate, and this was English teachers, by the way, so you'll understand that's quite alarming. We changed the statutory duty on schools from one where they obliged to provide advice and guidance to one where they must secure independent advice and guidance, and part of that's about ensuring that schools provide people with the full range of options available to them and equip them with the knowledge they need to choose from amongst those options. I think that's really important, so the vocational and practical options get their fair share of attention, and the people are aware of the options available in those respects. The other. Sorry to be verbose, but the other aspect of this is connections, and of course I've effectively replaced connections with a national career service, the first time an all-age service, which I expect to have contacts with people both face-to-face and through a really good web product and through a telephone helpline, and to have a presence in about 3,000 plus locations across the country. So those are the two things we've done about it.
And do you think schools are getting their budgets squeezed in this area so that they're really not able to devote enough resource to it, or are you happy that it's a relatively good match-up?
Well, don't forget, Chairman, they already have a statutory duty to provide careers advice and guidance.
Yes.
We're not adding a duty, we're changing a duty in those terms. So the advice and guidance they give at the moment, which they're obliged to do, is in our judgment patchy. Some schools do this rather well, many don't. And the aim of creating a duty on them to secure independent advice and guidance means that we think that many young people will get better quality advice about the options available to them.
And looking at work experience, I mean, a lot of employers have said to us that work experience is very, very important, and that there has been a change in the government's approach from really looking to have work experience for the younger group to having longer internships for the older group between 14 and 19. Is that right? And are you satisfied that there are good reasons for doing that? And if so, what are they?
Well, we're doing both. First of all, it remains very important that the 1 or 2 week work experience that typically happens in year 10 continues. And indeed, one of the things that we are seeking to do is to bust the health and safety myth that somehow there is an onerous duty of responsibility on the shoulders of an employer that makes it difficult to offer that opportunity. I was with a group of employers last week who were saying, well, we don't do this anymore because of health and safety reasons. And I said to them, there is absolutely no reason at all why you can't do that. Any suggestion that health and safety prevents you from doing that is nonsense. You have a duty to do a one-off risk assessment about what happens if you have young people coming into your workplace you don't have to do a risk assessment each time somebody comes into the workplace. And indeed, we should actively encourage employers to provide that opportunity.
And what exactly would you expect them to provide for the 14 to 16s, and what would you expect for the older group?
Well, I think it is a different need, and that we do take the view that the requirement for the older group is different and longer. For the 14 to 16s, I think it is a taster of the workplace. It's more often than not an opportunity to sit and take part and observe and do a few bits and pieces in the office, get a little bit of practical experience, often shadowing somebody else for a week or two. Once you move beyond school leaving age, it becomes much more of a transition to employment. One of the things we did very early on, the origins of our work experience scheme, was an email that I received from the mother of an 18-year-old who had left college, was looking for employment, had negotiated for herself a month's work experience with a local firm, and had been told by the job centre she couldn't do it because if she did she'd lose her benefits. Now that was palpable nonsense. So we took immediate steps to change the rules so you can now do up to 8 weeks whilst on benefits of work experience. But we actually started to use the Job Centre Plus employer liaison teams to ask employers not just where they were going to recruit someone permanently, but actually to provide an opportunity for young people to do a period of work experience.
Harriet Baldwin wants to just come in on this point. Sorry.
Well, it was on the health and safety point actually, because my own teenager just did some work experience and had to be CRB checked, and I wondered if that's another potential barrier to small employers that
What
might
was,
put
what was
them
the
on.
role?
It was volunteering with to help in a caring role with adults with learning difficulties.
Well, I mean, I think that when the CRB rules sit with, I think the Justice Department, but I have to say I would deplore that.
Have you heard that from anyone else? There was a barrier.
I've had
to
not to any
experience for
significant
young people.
degree. It's normally much more the process around risk assessments that put employers off. I mean, I do think that it is an exaggeration of the requirements, and if it's not, it should be an exaggeration of the requirements for a CRB check in that kind of situation, because to be honest, a 15-year-old who's doing work experience is going to be under adult supervision anyway. So I think it would be a desperate shame if that kind of opportunity were denied because of an excessive level of bureaucracy.
But if it were an employer, it was a sole proprietor and were offering work experience to a 15-year-old, the school might require the proprietor to be CRB checked.
Again, I mean, I would argue that should not be the case. That becomes a part of the routine. Otherwise, at the end of the day, we have to take a decision. Do we actually want to encourage employers to give young people an opportunity? In which case, from the employer's point of view, it's a hassle anyway, having somebody new in the office for a week or two. If we place too many onerous requirements on their shoulders, we just won't get those opportunities. And that's why we've been very keen to stress that in terms of risk assessments, you just need to do a one-off assessment. If I'm going to have young people coming into my workplace, is there anything obvious that could be an issue that when they first come in, I need to say, well, don't put your hand in here, for example. If once you've done that, that should do, and the health and safety rules are quite clear, that's all you need to do. In terms of CRB check, I mean, I think that would be wrong to impose that on all employers. Otherwise, if you look at the number of people within the workplace a young person might come into contact with, at the end of the day, the employer will turn around and say no.
Brenda Jackson and then Sheila wants to.
Yes, it's on the issue of the availability of work experience. We've had evidence presented to the committee that few schools actually contact employers in this area. So is there any, I mean, schools are being asked to do a lot, as it is. I mean, the independent careers advice, I'd love to know who qualifies to provide that independent careers advice, who does, and how are you encouraging employers to approach the schools in their areas to say, if you are running work experience schemes with your pupils, we'd like to be part of it. I mean, many of my schools, for example, are very assiduous in checking out the employers, and also once the child has done their work experience, in checking with the employer how well or badly they did. Are you pushing in that area,
Yeah.
or
Can I
is
just-
it being left to the schools?
Can I just add to that, Glenda, because it was the Recruitment and Employment Confederation who said that there were some schools where nobody had been allowed in for years.
Exactly.
That's the point.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're right, Chairman, and Glenda's right, that the performance across schools is quite variable. Some schools have very good relationships with local employers and engage children in work in that employer, and indeed bring employers into the school. Others less so. I think the aim of the National Careers Service should be to help with that based on the new duty I described earlier. So I hope that part of what will be provided in accessing independent advice is good links to those kind of opportunities with employers. And the aim of that is really to give the whole offer a more employment-based focus, so that the guidance that people get is not just about progressive learning. Of course, there's nothing wrong with progressive learning, but not just about that, but also about the link to employment and employers in exactly the kind of way you describe.
But what are you doing?
Well, we've established that service, we've changed the statutory duty. I've missioned the National Careers Service to facilitate just those kind of communications with schools. So this will be a universal service across schools rather than the patchy provision that's currently happening. This will create a greater consistency about that offer in exactly the way you recommend and call for.
But we've seen connections, for example, disappear.
Yes.
I mean, who in the school is going to whom will the school go with sufficient confidence that the person they're asking to afford that independent advice is capable of so doing?
Well,
and what are you doing with the employers?
Sorry, the other thing, of course, that's happened in the careers industry, and I congratulate them on this, is very much with our encouragement and support. They've developed the best set of professional standards they've ever had, based around the matrix standard, a new set of accreditations linked to that, an unprecedented level of cooperation amongst the bodies within the career sector in order to meet the new standards which will be demanded in the National Careers Service that schools will be engaging with. So schools for the first time will be engaging with a new set of high standard careers professionals who will be in touch with employment, with the character of the marketplace, with employers, and bring all of that understanding and knowledge into the school independently. This won't be a teacher, this will be an outside expert coming to the school equipped with that kind of understanding.
And who's paying for that expert advice?
Well, as I said in answer to the earlier question, schools are currently obliged by law to provide this. They are now going to be obliged by law to secure it. So they're already funding, resourcing the provision of advice and guidance. Our argument is that we want to make that better. We want to make it more consistent. We want to make it more empirical. That's precisely what we've done.
Sheila Gilt wants to come in.
Yeah, so I'm just maybe slightly confused here. About the question of work experience for the pupils. We were given to understand by some of the witnesses we've heard that they're concerned that the statutory duty on schools to provide this work experience has been removed. But, you know, from what was being said, it seems to suggest that schools are somehow still expected to do it. So no statutory duty, but we're just hoping they do it? Is that the...
But you all know, and I provided work experience, I'm sure you have, over the years for many young people. You all know that the very patchy provision that I described has been what has prevailed. What we're hoping we can move to as a result of some of the changes we're making is routinely a much higher quality offer by making the relationship between employment and the sort of advice and guidance that young people get, the engagement with the professionals in the school, one which is bound to give both a more independent but also a better quality range of options to young people.
But a school could choose not to do work experience at all. At
Sorry?
that age. A school could choose not to do work experience for pupils in that age group.
I certainly don't think that. I think it's very
Well, the statutory
it's
duty-
very good that schools have relationships with employers, and
if the statutory duty has been removed, that's what I'm asking. So you know, that's what we were told by some witnesses. Just hoping that schools do it, because presumably schools can take decide decide what we don't want to do work experience. It's too.
But there may be, Chairman, a fundamental disagreement between Sheila and I on this, in that I seek to drive up standards not by creating baseline regulation, but by creating an example as a best practice, which then become the norm, and normalising excellence. You know, I've set about deregulating large swathes of the further education sector, not because I want it to be less good, but because I want it to be better.
And I think it is more about the timing of the work experience than saying that there isn't a duty to do it. It's just the timing of it, isn't it? Because it used to be a duty at Key Stage 4. But can I ask you about the match between the sort of courses that young people are undertaking and the jobs which are available in the jobs market, a subject I've asked you both about in the past? I mean, do you think we're getting that match right?
Well, I think there are two aspects to that, Chairman. One is, are people getting the core skills they need, which frankly most employment necessitates? And secondly, are they getting the more vocational competencies they need to go into particular careers? On the core skills, you'll know that the government has set about, since we came to power, revisiting the issue of core skills. Under the last administration, according to parliamentary answers, about 40,000 16-year-olds left school each year functionally illiterate and or innumerate. That is not acceptable. It's a subject you raised, personally, if I might say so, a number of times on the floor of the House, Chairman. We believe that a refocus on those core skills is essential in order to equip people with what they need to go on to prosper in progressive learning or employment. The second issue is around vocational practical skills, and you'll know, simultaneously, we've put new emphasis on post-16 skills in respect of apprenticeships and have grown the apprenticeship number very significantly indeed, precisely because we believe that many people with practical, technical and vocational tastes and talents need their chance to gain the skills best suited to their subsequent employment, and we built the biggest apprenticeship programme in modern history.
It's worth saying, Mr. Heald, that, and I would encourage the committee as part of this report to take a look at the work that's just been completed by the UK Commission on Employment and Skills. You may have already done so, but it was very striking in the report that they published 10 days ago that they identified amongst all the barriers to young people entering employment, employers cited educational issues in only a very small number of cases. A far bigger challenge for us is simply to encourage employers to give young people the chance in the first place.
Yeah.
Very often they're just simply not considering those young people at all. But it was reassuring. I mean, I think we still face significant skills challenges. It's a constantly evolving world. As a team, we need to constantly be looking at what is the next thing that needs to be done to keep ahead of the game. And I think that the apprenticeship programme expansion offers a really good route to achieve that. But it is worth noting that that's not at the top of the list of barriers when you actually do quantitative work with employers that they cite.
They talk about the right attitude, don't they? But anyway, Glenda Jackson wants to come in on the Wolf report.
I do. I mean, slightly, well, it's sort of bleeding over from what we've been discussing just now, but I mean, the idea that a school's priority, for example, is to advise on vocational, or I presume academic, but that's not really helping, is it, in the issue of getting young people into a kind of working mode of knowing what work is about?
Well, I think it's partly about what are loosely described as employability skills. But my case there, I have to say, Chairman, is one of robust defence of young people. I mean, at 14 and 15 and 16, can young people really be expected to have employability skills? Of course they can't. And when employers complain that 16-year-olds haven't got employability skills, I don't quite know what they expect. What they might reasonably anticipate is that people can read, write and count, have reasonable degree of self-discipline, have a reasonable set of values that have been imparted part by their family and part by their schooling. That seems to be perfectly reasonable. I think you said in an earlier session of this committee, Mr. Chairman, that young people came forward and weren't always able to prepare their CV. I've got the details here. You talked about young people applying for jobs, the applications being faulted because of the absence of core skills which allow people to prepare a good CV. That's pretty basic stuff, and if schools can't help people to acquire that kind of confidence, they certainly need to start doing it.
Well, carrying on from that, I mean, certainly the Wolf review found that there's a kind of mismatch between the approach to planning the pattern of education, of skilling young people, and the actual, whether that matches up with the needs of the labour market. And the changes between the funding, I mean, the changes that have been brought about by the Skills Funding Agency, is that acting as a plus or a minus in trying to match this? And what precisely, or rather how precisely, can colleges, schools, further education, how can they be informed of what is the needs in the labour market when obviously at the moment there's very high unemployment rate, the basic kind of skills, the heavy industries that we used to have in the past have gone. How are they to be kept on board with what is the floating requirements of the employment?
I think, if I might say so, I think that's a very good question, and that's something I've been grappling with since becoming the minister. I think the only way of doing it is to create a greater employer engagement in the skills system. We just announced that I'm about to announce it. I've just looked at the draft of the first round of our employer ownership pilot. Chairman, we put 250 million into a pilot where we've invited employers to come together and start to define what they think the skills system provided. Many have actually done so in concert with FE providers, with other consortia, to try and get employers to drive the system. This is being run by the UK Commission for Employment Skills that my honourable friend referred to a moment ago, because a demand-led system is likely to be a system where provision meets need to a much greater degree than it has historically. I think the only way of doing it is to make the FE and skills system respond closely to the changing character of employer demand, to make it more responsive, more sensitive. You have to put employers in the driving seat, and that's what I've been trying to do.
But employers, I mean, certainly on the evidence that this committee has received, are virtually universal in condemning the fitness of young people leaving our educational establishments for work. Now, they're not going on the basis, as you said earlier, of the educational qualifications. They're talking about all the soft skills. So, being able to get up in the morning, knowing how to answer a phone, being able to look somebody in the eye when they have a conversation. How is that being translated into between the employer and the school?
Well, can I pick up that point? I think, first of all, in defence of young people, what is particularly enlightening about the UK CES research is the number of employers who would not even consider hiring a young person and therefore don't sit down and talk to them. Now, I had one of those classic cases, exactly that point, a few weeks ago. A woman running a business in Manchester emailed me and said, I know you're talking about hiring young people, but they're all a bunch of feckless youngsters and I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. So I sent her an email back saying, well, why don't you just try one of our work experience people and just see how you get on? And last week I had a very sheepish email back from her saying, well, maybe you were right. We were sent a young woman and she's really good. She's the first here in the morning. She's working really well and I'm now trying to recast my budget so I can hire her permanently. So I think, of course, there are issues, but how many of us were actually the finished item at the moment we left school, university or college? And actually every employer that takes somebody on for the first time must accept there's a few rough edges of development left. But I think that the degree to which young people are simply ill-equipped for the workplace is greatly exaggerated. It's certainly a problem in some cases, but I think it does down the reputation of young people generally if that seems to be the general view.
But should the funding agencies be playing a more proactive role here and laying down the rules? I mean, you're very clear about the responsibility of school.
Yeah.
With respect to both of you, you seem a bit woolly with regard to the responsibilities of employers.
No, I think employers have got a fundamental responsibility. Part of the reason that I boosted apprenticeships in the way that I described earlier is because, of course, they're jobs with training. And I insisted, by the way, that all apprenticeships should be jobs. Like we insisted that they should be, that all apprenticeships should be employed. And that's about a partnership, isn't it, between an employer, government doing its bit, and the trainee, the apprentice, doing theirs. no better place to gain employability skills than in the workplace, being mentored. That's a great example of how a young person can acquire the kind of, in inverted commas, soft skills that you mentioned whilst they're doing a job and whilst they're learning.
But an apprenticeship isn't soft skills. I mean, the requirements for an apprenticeship are really written quite large. What we're getting consistently from employers is the majority of young people, in my day it was called a work ethic, don't seem to have any work ethic, and there seem to be few, if any, programs that are engaged actively in skilling young people in this area. For example, within my own constituency, there was an extremely effective program among some of the most difficult to reach young people in my borough, and a local drama school. Now that scheme has gone. I don't know whether it's the SFA who pulled away the funding or the EFA, but they were actively working with young people who, when they first came into the room, couldn't look anybody in the eye and say good morning.
Yeah, but
now, those are the kind of skills that employers are telling us that they want. They don't want people to be able to do apprenticeships. They want to be able to answer the phone, say good morning to people, be nice if it's a retail thing.
But don't forget that, I don't want to get into pressure. I'll answer the main thrust of your question in a moment. Just remember what an apprenticeship actually is about. It is, of course, about acquiring a practical competence, but it's also about communicating with people, getting to know other people in the workforce, getting to understand that you have to turn up on time, getting to understand that actually you have to interface with all kinds of other individuals of all kinds of different ages and competencies as part of working life. But on your fundamental point, frankly, if someone can't present adequately after the years of statutory schooling, and let's not forget this begins when they're tiny and they're taken from their parents' bosom and obliged to go into a place of learning, then that's a poor reflection on what we're doing long before they get to the age of 16. So the re-emphasis that we're putting on core values, on absolute insistence on the kind of the independence, the responsibility, the disciplines and rigour that you recommend with such vehemence should be music to your ears.
Can I just pick up on this point as well? I mean, when you say that there's no focus on employability, that's absolutely not the case. I mean, in the work programme, we have the biggest programme of support for the longer term unemployed, and in terms of young people, that can mean as little as 3 months for those from difficult backgrounds. The biggest programme we've had in this country. It is built around payment by results, so therefore the organisations delivering have to build employability amongst those people who perhaps don't have it, or they simply won't be rewarded. They won't manage to get people into work, young people into work, and won't be rewarded for what they do. So I would absolutely refute that we have no programmes of support in place that deliver employability support, just the opposite. And I absolutely accept that there are some young people who emerge from school, college and university who are not as yet particularly employable. Now that may be for reasons of their background, it may be because they're trying to do the wrong things, but we're absolutely focused on helping those young people. But what I would also say is it's not the majority. If you look at the patterns of unemployment for young people, the majority move off benefits within 3 months. And so, for some, it's about finding the right starting point, and we're doing everything we can to help them find the right starting point. What you're describing is certainly there, but all I'm saying is I don't want that to be seen to reflect young people in the workforce as a whole, because most young people are keen, enthusiastic, want to get into jobs.
Well, speak to the employers, because that is certainly their view.
I've got 2 members who want to come in, so can we have Karen Bradley and Sheila Gilmore?
I just wanted to just touch on the apprenticeships point and about communication of the apprenticeships. I'm desperately trying to organise as much in my own constituency to promote apprenticeships. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, Minister, and I want to make sure we do all we can. When we took evidence from the National Apprenticeship Service, they told us that they were doing all they could to promote locally and to contact all the stakeholders locally to make sure that the apprenticeships were being promoted. As it happened during that evidence session, I received an email from my office, which I didn't get till after we'd finished, saying that they'd spent the whole morning trying to find out who was the local representative of the NAS and did I have any ideas of where we might find them, which was a shame I got it after the session because I could have asked who it was during the session. But just to make the point, Minister, that the apprenticeships scheme is very, very good, but people need to know how to get hold of it and to find the right person quickly and easily.
I entirely agree. We certainly need to be mindful of marketing. I successfully applied for a marketing exemption, and we have this policy on marketing, as you know, Chairman, and in order to promote apprenticeships in the way you describe. And the ask I've made of the National Apprenticeship Service has been a great one. We've grown apprenticeship numbers on the last year's figures by 90%, and including a 30% rise in apprentices for very young people. And that's, of course, put pressure on the marketing, because the more you do, the more there is to do, as it were. But you're right. I think we need to be constantly vigilant about the need to get the word out. One of the difficulties is getting out to very small businesses, actually, getting to the SMEs, because unless you've got apprenticeships seeded in SMEs, you simply don't get the coverage or accessibility that you want. So I hear what you say. I'll certainly go back to the NAS again with that. Something I might recommend, perhaps advertised through you, Chairman, is that a number of areas, of course, have run the 100 Apprenticeships in 100 Days campaign very successfully with their local newspapers.
Yes. Well,
And
as
may
you
I-
know, in my
It was
area,
still
of course, we've done this, and
Well,
you have been very pleased with our national
I was
association.
massaging your ego,
But,
Chairman, unnecessarily.
That's
We've-
exactly what we were
we've
trying
got
to launch in
Sheila
the
Gilmore
Maulers.
to
But
come.
deservedly. Unnecessarily, but deservedly.
Mr. Grayling will probably be astonished to know that I'm actually quite heartened by something he just said, and he probably thinks that's quite unusual. But I think there seems to be different, and there's even different voices coming out here. There's certainly a lot of different voices that we've heard in terms of whether there's some feeling in young people effectively, and or the education they're receiving, or whether there are actually some other more difficult things going on here, because and I think from what the Minister of Employment said, that he seems to believe that actually on the whole young people are not necessarily any worse prepared than kind of they ever were, because there does seem to be this implicit to all of this is that somehow we've got worse at doing this, and there used to be a wonderful time when it was done. I mean, I'm not convinced that there was, either sort of my own experience, my children's experience, or indeed the fact that I recall a huge campaign being run by government about 20 years ago on adult literacy, because there was such a gap in adult literacy, which suggests that the education some 20 years before that was probably deficient. So, I mean, I think, is all this debate actually helping, or shouldn't we really be looking around to trying to do something more practical?
Well, I think it's a very important point, and that's why I stress, look, we are talking about, in particular, the challenge that is posed to us by around 20%, give or take, of those young people who leave education, who have not left education with the skills that we need them to have, who often come from a family background where a working life has not been the norm, who have low aspirations in life, and they have a pretty difficult start in adult life and in the workplace. And they represent a very real challenge for us, and among some of those people you find the attitude problems that Ms. Jackson was talking about, and they are the people who will typically, more likely than not, need the kind of support we're providing through the work programme, may need some of the work that John is doing to enhance skills for those who ended up leaving school without what they need. They're the people that the Education Secretary is trying to catch earlier and deliver an environment where we can develop them better. The other group I think that represent a challenge for us is are those coming out of university who have not got as clear a focus about what they can realistically achieve as possible. And we do need to, I think, provide a better, I think our universities could do an important job in this, provide better guidance to those leaving university, because I meet many people, for example, young people who've come out of university and who've done a specific course in the media, for example, who hope to get a job in the media but don't think laterally about how to get there. They spend month after month just applying for media jobs without thinking, well, if I did this and then that, I could get in by a different route. They need smart careers advice. And one of the things that John Hayes and I have done is we've brought careers advisors into job centres as well, so that when either of those groups fall into an environment where they need extra guidance and advice on careers, that advice is there and close to hand.
I don't know why media always gets the blame for this sort of thing, because my own experience was that having a history degree didn't necessarily prepare you for work either.
No, it's not about the preparation of work, it's about your expectations. If you do a specific degree that appears to lead you into a particular career area, you may not get there in one step.
Just poor old media studies always has a problem.
That is
Well,
true.
we'll take Harriet now, and then we'll need to make some progress to get on to the
Can
other
I
issues.
just ask one more question about the apprenticeships?
Yes, we'll do Harriet,
Fine.
your question on the apprenticeships,
Thank
and then we'll move on to Job Centre Plus.
Just a simple statistical question, really. There are 457,000 apprenticeships in 2010-11,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to find out, we should know by now, how many of those led to jobs? Do we
Well,
have
a
a
very
percentage success rate?
significant number. We know that people who do apprenticeship are more likely to get a job, keep a job, and progress in a job. And as you know, there's a piece of work done quite recently by the National Audit Office, which gauged the effectiveness of apprenticeships and found that they represented immensely good public investment for the very reason that people's job prospects improved markedly, as well as their productivity and subsequent progress.
So the very significant percentage is what? 80%?
More.
90%?
Yeah.
Over 90%?
Yes, but the reason I'm hesitating slightly is because by quoting an average, I don't want to mislead the committee about the value of different levels of apprenticeship and kinds of apprenticeship, nor do I want to discount the fact that very significant numbers of apprentices, as a deliberate result of policy, are people who are improving their skills who are already in a job. So in coming to a conclusion about them who, as you put it, get or keep a job, one needs to differentiate between people who begin their job with an apprenticeship and people who take on an apprenticeship already in work. And that's why I'm hesitating slightly, because I don't want to egg up our record more than it deserves, which is actually quite a lot, but more than it deserves.
So, but you will monitor how many people will have got into work as a result of the apprenticeship pathway?
Not only will I monitor it, I think it might be helpful, Mr. Heald, if I wrote to the committee with drawing out some of those facts for your consideration, so that I can illustrate the point I made about improved work prospects, earning potential, and subsequent progress.
And gender breakdown, do we know the gender breakdown?
Yes, we've changed that. We've made, because, we are, I'm very anxious to ensure that both across gender, ethnicity, and other considerations, we are doing best by everyone who has the potential to gain practical skill and employment as a result. And I can tell the committee, Mr. Heald, for the first time under this government, there are more female apprentices than male apprentices. So we are rather proud of the progress we've made in those terms.
My question on apprenticeships was, previous witnesses have said that they support the apprenticeship scheme, as does everybody around this room. But there is no real clear provision for people who require pre-apprenticeship assistance. They tend to be some of the hardest to reach. Are you looking into this? Is this going to be supported in any way?
It's a point that this committee made in its fifth special report of session 2010-11.
So you're going to do something about it,
Glenda, and specifically, and you don't often get a minister who highlights something where I think we can do more. But specifically, the committee said we are concerned that apprenticeship may not be the most suitable route into employment for those young people at the highest risk of long-term unemployment. And essentially what that's about is the bridge into apprenticeships, which after all are level 2 qualification, for those with very poor levels of prior attainment. I agree, Glenda, there's more to be done on that. Let me tell you what we started. I began a pilot looking at taking people with very low levels of prior attainment and creating what I called access to apprenticeship courses, which would then take them to the point where they could begin a level 2 apprenticeship. Several thousand young people are on that. I had a meeting about it this morning with my officials. I want to extend it further, but I also want to make sure that some of our best apprenticeship employers make sure those people then get a chance to move on into a level 2 and ultimately beyond that into long-term training or a job. I think we've made a good start, but I think it's an area we can do a lot more. You said it then, you've said it again today, and I agree with you.
And have you any figures to show that it's working?
Yes, it is working. We, because it's quite a tough call, this, because we are often taking people who are a long way from the labour market, with actually quite poor levels of prior attainment, depending on their personal history, of course. But actually, we've got over 5,000 people now engaged in this pilot, which is quite a significant number. I want to build that to 10,000. I think that will give us a really good opportunity to look at the characteristics of the offer, see how we can adjust it, and see how we can then build on it as a much bigger offer. I'd like to call them traineeships, pre-apprenticeship training, traineeships, which take people to the point where they get onto level 2 qualification. So it is working, but I want it to work more. And
are employers expanding? I mean, are there more employers participating?
Yes, but I think we can do more on that. I've today asked for a seminar, a conference in the autumn. I asked the National Apprenticeship Service this morning to organise this, and in anticipation of the penetrating questions that I knew would come from this committee on this subject, because I want big apprenticeship employers, those large employers who already offer large numbers of apprenticeships, to take a close look at this and to make some commitments about the young people they'll take on through this route.
And perhaps in your document, you could just, that you've kindly offered to send us, you could include a section on this.
Yes, I'd be delighted to, Chairman, of course.
And now we've got Sheila Gilmore on the role of the Job Centre Plus.
Yeah. When we started this investigation, we were told that JCP were taking on around 4,000 staff to provide the extra support. Some of those would be people who would have their temporary contracts extended or made permanent. Are we now skilled up? Are we now?
We are.
Those numbers are all up to.
I couldn't swear that absolutely every one of those 4,000 is in place, but we started a big recruitment exercise back in February. We have extended the contracts for a number of the fixed contract staff. We actually had a number of very good staff on fixed term contracts, and I think there was some degree of relief in the organisation that we were able to extend some of those. The aim, as you will know, is to be able to offer a weekly intervention rather than a fortnightly one from the 5-month point. But what actually has been very encouraging is that many job centres have adapted the local flexibilities we've given them to actually provide more regular contact even earlier in the job search process.
So could you explain that a bit more?
Well, I mean, for example, I was in a job centre recently where they've actually started doing weekly contacts from the first time somebody signs on. Now, that won't always be an interview. It may be a telephone call. It may be an exchange of email or text messages, but there's a weekly contact, not a fortnightly one, for people who've only been unemployed for a few weeks. What we try to do with Job Centre Plus is give as much frontline flexibility as possible. What I don't want is them all operating by edict from the centre. And we're seeing sort of encouraging local initiatives like that to say, well, actually we can, within the team we've got, do more in this particular area, and they're doing it.
So is it possible to say what the sort of average amount of time an advisor spends with a young person?
Well, they will do. They'll do the classic fortnightly signing, but there isn't a single answer to that because it will vary enormously from job centre to job centre.
Is there any sort of target for how much time you'd expect it to be?
We don't set targets. So, but basically now, the thing that drives.
I suppose what I'm asking is, could you know, we've said we're going to increase it to once a week. Could that be simply a text message, or are they going to have work-focused interviews? What's the?
Well, I mean, at the 5-month point, it's coming in and sitting down with an advisor every week. Before that, it could be a text message. I know that's kicking around in the media a while back. It might be, you know, once a week a text message from an advisor saying how are you getting on, but that's only because it's a way that is viable and sensible to make contact with that person. But no, from the 5-month point, it's actually a weekly face-to-face, not just a text message. But we're trying to take as flexible an approach as possible. What we're after, the thing that now drives job centres, in the past they had a paraphernalia of different targets. The thing that now drives them is the flow off benefits, and that's what we're trying to achieve. That's the most important thing, is are people moving off benefits? And the thing that gets Job Centre Plus teams most fired up and most motivated is, are they actually getting to the goals that they've been set, either set themselves or been set by us, to get the number of people off benefits that they want.
Could I just on that, how does that work, for example, for some of the hardest to reach or those with special educational needs? and this is entirely anecdotal and it's directly from my own constituency. You say you don't like targets, but the applicant has to report at a specific time, and it's not infrequent that the individual who should be giving them the face-to-face assistance isn't there, and that is not something that's covered. So what's happening in that area?
Well, we've also, one of the changes we've introduced in the past 18 months, which is now bedded in across most of the Job Centre Plus network, is that an individual claimant will see the same person regularly. What happened in the past is that they'd come in, it was just whoever was available. But we've now moved to a situation where an individual will have a permanent advisor to themselves. And so it should not be the case. This is something that's rolling out across the Job Centre Plus network. It is not there absolutely everywhere, but it's rolling out rapidly. And so the situation for somebody in your constituency who's got a particular challenge in life is they should be seeing the same person every fortnight, with the occasional issues like holidays and so forth, but typically they'll be dealing with the same advisor. And of course we've got people who've got specialisms in disability. We have specialist disability advisors, we have special advisors and specialist advisors working with young people. But increasingly what they're getting is consistency of contact.
But it's still fairly thin on the ground.
Which bit's thin on the ground?
Both. I mean, both the people with, say, some form of disability, or young people who are hard to reach.
Well, there's a disability advisor in every job centre, of course.
Yeah, but that's just one person. There'll be more than one person with disabilities.
That's true, but I mean
we do come on to
disability. Is a wide range of things. I mean, maybe somebody's got a minor disability and is able to deal with an advisor who's got mainstream skill.
Sheila Gilmore on the work experience question. Sorry.
Some of the evidence we've already had, as you're probably aware, have been some concerns that people have had about the rollout to creating 250,000 extra work experience placements, and what is being done to ensure that those would be quality work experience placements that are not just going for numbers?
Well, the first thing to say is that if we, and I've been very clear internally, if we ever suspected that an employer was simply exploiting someone, then we wouldn't place a young person in a work experience place there. The whole philosophy behind the timing and the nature of the work experience approach was that it was clearly ridiculous to have a situation where somebody who did more than 2 weeks work experience couldn't because they lost their benefits. Equally, there comes a point at which work experience migrates into exploitation. I have to say, I do not like long-term unpaid internships. We can't as a society, I think, prevent people from volunteering and employers allowing them to volunteer, but I do not like long-term unemployed internships. I think my judgment was that 8 weeks was a sensible dividing line. That for the first 2 months, I mean, if you take on a new employee in your office, first couple of months they're really getting up to speed, and after that they should be kind of ready to carry on doing good stuff for you. 8 weeks is long enough in my view for somebody to get familiar with the workplace, to start to show what they can do, to begin to make a bit of a difference, to a point an employer can say, I really like them, I'd like to keep them. It's not long enough for somebody to be able to plan their business on the basis of using exploited labour. Because actually if you're changing a workforce every 8 weeks, then it's a huge management effort, and I think it's simply not cost effective for them. So we consciously took the decision to go for the 8 weeks. And what we're seeing is, right, it's not mandatory to be 8 weeks, it can be up to 8 weeks. Ironically, the controversial Tesco scheme was 4 weeks, and you really can't. If you've got someone for 4 weeks, you don't have time to actually take them beyond the point of finding which way round everything is, to a point where you can use and abuse them. And indeed, one of the things I've found most disappointing about the criticisms of work experience, if you take the most recent thing, the decision of Holland and Barrett to pull out after the most unpleasant pressure from extremist protesters who were spitting at staff, who were abusing customers. Holland and Barrett had a really good scheme. 8 weeks working in different bits of the business, and at the end of it you got a qualification. Now how that could be described by anybody as a bad thing is beyond me, and they were taking on a significant number of the young people who went and did that 8 weeks. Many of them were staying with Holland and Barrett, those that didn't had a qualification to take elsewhere. So, I mean, the guidance we'd give to Job Centre Plus staff is, if you've got doubts about an employer, don't use them. But we have, I mean, in numbers terms, Our aim is to have total across the youth contract support for the period covered about 450,000 different pieces of the jigsaw. The aim is to have 100,000 placements, work experience with a training module attached to it per year. We're building up to that. The impact of the row in February was not as significant as I feared. We haven't seen a big drop-off in places. It's growing slightly less fast than I would have hoped, but we will get to where we need to get to. And we will continue to encourage employers to offer the opportunity. And the key point to make is, actually, a short period of work experience of a few weeks is an investment by an employer, not the other way around.
Do you have any figures for...
Can I bring in Karen, because she's
yeah.
been waiting patiently to just come in on.
A very quick point, Minister. Something that's been put to me by constituents is they feel that somehow the employers are using the work experience as an alternative to taking on someone else into a full-time job. They're using it as cheap labour. You would disagree with that?
I just don't see that this is a reality, partly because of the time it takes to develop someone. I think that it's a fear that's simply not grounded in reality. If you talk to any employer, they'll say in the first few weeks it's an investment by us, not the other way around. But I think the biggest reason that this is important, if you look at that UK CES survey last week of employer attitudes to recruiting young people, most employers are not even taking a look at young people. They're not even considering somebody who is fresh from school, college or university for a position. And they're doing it, I suspect, in part because of the perceptions, in part because it's a hassle for them, because they've got to make that initial investment. And what we're dealing with is a situation where all too often an employer is looking on the one hand at a young person straight out of education without previous experience, and somebody who's coming in from Eastern Europe who's got 5 or 6 years experience, who's got plenty of get up and go because they've gone to the effort of coming here, and it becomes an easy decision for them. And what I'm trying to do is level the playing field.
I mean,
and what work experience is in part about is levelling that playing field, because if you get the young person into the workplace, then they've got a chance of impressing and staying there.
We heard at I'm going to bring in Harriet for a second, but we heard at a job centre last week that in terms of sector-based work academy placements, this row has actually damaged the retail projects rather than the other sectors.
Yes.
And it shows in a way that young people have been disadvantaged by the protest. But Harriet?
Well, similar to a topical case, really. Do you think that it's possible that the reason G4S weren't able to fulfil their Olympic contract was that they were offering work experience rather than actual jobs?
It's a difficult one. Some of the qualifications to get into the security industry actually require you to have done some work experience on the job. If you look at the issue we had at the time of the Jubilee, quite a lot of those participants were actually going through a GMVQ that requires you to get some practical experience. And I think there's quite a big difference between the two, and there are lots of training courses, different shapes, sizes and descriptions that require you to do some practical work as part of the training course, separate to a pure work experience period. To be honest, I think not. I mean, I think there's big questions to ask about why there appear to be a large number of people who want to work as security guards at the Olympics who don't seem to have been processed appropriately. I had an email from a constituent in that position this afternoon. So no, I don't think it's to do with the work experience. I think it's much more down to the fact that at first glance it looks as if there are people who genuinely want to do it, who have not been processed in time and in the right way. And I think the company will have some clear questions to answer on that.
Back to Sheila now.
Yeah, just back to the work experience issue. And sometimes I think I'm on different visits from other members of the committee, but perhaps not. We just hear what we want to hear. One of the issues that was raised, I thought, when we went to the job centre, was that in fact the number of opportunities in retail had fallen, not because of the dislike of the work experience scheme, but actually because the retail demand was falling. I've also heard employees see in certain big department stores in Edinburgh that there has been less people taken on of late for things like sort of Christmas and so on, than previously. Now, some people would put that down to it's because they're taking work experience people, but it might be down to retail demand. How do you disentangle that kind of thing? Because, you know, people want to kind of hit various different things over the head with that.
Well, I think the focus is always on retail, and retail, for some reason, you would have believed from all the debates in the media that this was just about retail. And of course, it's in lots of sectors, lots of different kinds of businesses. Interestingly, a lot of the noise that took place in relation to individual organisations was linked with organisations that had themselves been struggling, were perhaps concerned about corporate reputation, and were having difficulties. It's very easy to see demons where there are none. And my view remains that it is very difficult for a short period of time, and the retailers are typically only bringing somebody in for 4 or 5 weeks. It is very difficult in a period of 4 or 5 weeks to bring somebody who's completely raw, out of school, college, or university, doesn't have a previous work history, and get them up to the point where they can actually deliver good service to your customers. You know, you need lots of supervision in the early days, you need lots of training. You can't just walk someone through the door and say, well, look, there's part of the shop, you go and look after it. It just doesn't work like that. And if you tried to do that, you know, you would end up with clothes on the wrong racks, or products in the wrong place, or customers given the wrong information, and your business would be damaged. So I don't believe any sensible employer would try and take that approach. If you look at those retailers that take staff on over Christmas, they tend to employ them for a longer period of time. They tend to employ, I think, more experienced people, or people, you know, if it's young people, it's people who've got previous retailing experience. I don't believe that there are employers who are using the work experience scheme as a replacement for labour. But if I ever found that there were, if anybody ever delivered genuine evidence to me that said this is actually what's happening, would simply instruct Job Centre Plus to stop placing people there.
Okay, just finally, how much tracking has been done? I mean, figures again are being thrown around. I think one of our witnesses suggested that only 6% of people on work experience got a job with the employer that they've been with, and from the sounds of it, they must all have been with Holland and Barrett. So others will use that as a springboard. Mm-hmm. Is that being tracked so that, you know, you'll have some clear figures about this
it's
to know
actually,
what works?
It's actually quite difficult to track how many stay with the same employer. You would have to do a sort of enormous monitoring exercise around the country that would cost lots of money, and I just don't think it would be cost effective to do that. What I'm concerned about is the impact of the propensity to be on benefits. And it has an impact, it has a measurable impact. It's not transformational, but it's a very cheap scheme. You know, it costs a very small amount of money to organise placements. It measurably increases the propensity of somebody to move off benefits, most normally into employment, sometimes back into to education. I mean, as you'll know from previous discussions, the off-benefits data is not a very exact science, but it certainly has a measurable impact on the likelihood of somebody being on benefits or not. And certainly anecdotally, if you talk to Job Centre Plus staff, you find plenty of examples of people who stayed on with the employers, very often of employers who will recast their budgets to try and hire a young person, perhaps as an apprentice, because they thought they're really good.
It would be nice to know that, though, wouldn't it?
But it's one of those things you say you can measure everything, but actually at a time of financial austerity and when there's lots of challenges, to start to put in place lots of extra mechanisms to try and track and monitor, and you'd have to go back to each individual and check what was happening to them. I just don't think it would be cost effective. Yes, I'd like to know, but I have to take decisions that are practical in terms of what's sensible to spend money on and not.
And now we'll move on to wage incentives with Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much. I'd want to deal with the effectiveness of wage incentive schemes, not the value for money. We're going to come on to questions on those later, so just to be clear what we're asking here. And the first question is, what evidence is there that wage incentives work?
The answer is patchy around the world. There isn't a clear evidence. Certainly that the evidence, for example, on some of the national insurance incentives is not absolute. But the very clear message we got from employers and from the employer groups was that this would make a material difference to our propensity to hire a young person. Now, we haven't in this country done a wage incentive in quite this way before. So we're in test zone. I'm quite clear we're in test zone. But we believe, and this, we had extensive discussions with organisations like the CBI, that this approach, which is very simple, it's very unbureaucratic, has a chance of levelling that playing field. And so our view was that at a time when youth unemployment is still much too high, where we want to level the playing field between an inexperienced person and an experienced person, that this was something that was worth doing. So I cannot sit in front of the committee and say we sat there with hot towels over our heads and lots of international evidence. Sometimes you've just got to believe something's worth a try. And so far, and the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, the decision we took about how to structure the wage incentive was we want to try to avoid paying for the same thing twice. So therefore, we're certainly not going to pay. If you look at the flows off benefits, most young people move off benefits within 3 months. 3 to 9 months, you've got more likely than not to move off benefits. Between that period, our focus is very much about trying to get you into the workplace to get work experience, for example, filling any skills gaps through the short-term courses that John and I set up together. We took the view that we would not spend money on the wage incentive until they got to the point of entering the work programme and became long-term unemployed. And so the money was deployed alongside placements achieved through the work programme. If you look at the figures we published for the first 3 months, now they're only job entry data, it's very rough and ready, but it seems to have had a significant impact on the propensity to hire young people. We won't know for some time really truly what the impact is, but my first view is that this has been a positive contributor.
I mean, one of the things that we've heard from the evidence is that from an employer's point of view, it might just make the difference in terms of, on the margins, in terms of perhaps making them employ someone earlier than they would have done. Is that something you're aware of? And if that's the case, is that good enough?
It's not so much even the earlier than they would have done. I think it's trying to break down the resistance to hiring at all. And there are two sentiments that I find amongst employers. There are those who say, actually, it's very expensive to hire a particularly unskilled young person, and therefore I wouldn't do it because I can spend lots of my own money. One well-known businessman I spoke to recently runs an engineering business said to me, look, I value taking on apprentices, but I get nothing out of them the first year. So therefore, providing financial support either through the supported apprenticeship package that John has got or through the wage subsidy to cover part of that cost reduces the kind of resistance to employ on the basis it's going to cost me lots of money. The other element is simply that it opens the door in the first place. If we're knocking on the door of somebody saying, okay, you're not even considering hiring a young person, but you will get a financial incentive to do so. For a small business, it actually makes that hire more cost effective. One of the things I always say to businesses, if you hire a young person, either using the wage subsidy or if you go through the apprenticeship route, you're getting somebody who could potentially be very good for you pretty inexpensively. And that's a good commercial deal for you. It's well worth doing. I hope what we've done now is to create a situation where it's actually a smart move to hire a young person in a way perhaps it wasn't.
And how will you measure the success of the wage incentives?
Most obviously in seeing an acceleration in the propensity for 18 to 24-year-olds who are on the work programme or who are from the most acute areas of youth unemployment to get into the workplace, and we will track that quarter by quarter. And we'll be able to see through job outcome data in the work programme the impact from April onwards of the wage incentive, and then the trends in both getting into work and sustaining employment. So we'll be tracking it quarter by quarter.
So you'll be able to compare both pre and post having wage incentive, and also the difference between those groups that have the wage incentive and those that don't.
Yes, we will.
On take-up, the target is 160,000 wage incentives. That's a big number and will substantially exceed anything that we've seen before. How confident are you that there will be take-up at that level?
Well, the first quarter has been very interesting. We did a rough and ready exercise with the work programme providers a couple of weeks ago. We asked them to go through their books and come back to us and tell us how many job starts they'd had for young people between 18 and 24 since the 1st of April. And the total is 17,100. Now, obviously not all of those 17,100 17,100 job starts would, if they sustained for 6 months, be eligible for the wage subsidy. So clearly, if that happened every quarter for 3 years, we'd have a budget problem. Now, in reality, they won't all sustain for 6 months, and they won't all end up claiming the subsidy payment. But actually, as a starting point, it suggests an encouraging level of take-up and a very healthy level of those longer-term unemployed young people moving into work.
I think that's helpful because that explains the press release that we've seen today from the department about the First Work Programme data showing promising signs, and the 17,000 we weren't quite sure what the number was. So that is work startups. They've not reached the point yet to qualify the incentive, but they've gone into
the
some
incentive. But basically, small employers are entitled to an interim payment if they want it after 8 weeks.
Yeah.
But we won't start paying out till 6 months, so we won't make in the first significant payments until October.
And have any of the 8 weeks payments been made yet?
A very small number. I mean, a few tens so far.
Okay. One of the concerns that a number of witnesses have expressed, and I think it's a concern that I can understand, is how to communicate this to the employers who might want to take up the youth contract. And certainly when I went to my local job club run by my community voluntary services, their big message was, please find more employers to come forward to volunteer to take on people on the youth contract. So what will the department be doing to communicate about the youth contract to make sure as many employers, particularly small businesses, find out about it?
We're doing a number of things. Most immediately, I've personally written to 350,000 employers, telling them this support is available. We have held a number of events with trade bodies, and we've particularly focused on the trade bodies to try and get them to disseminate information to their members as well. So we've done a lot of work with the trade bodies, a lot of road shows. Job Centre Plus staff also obviously are seeking to promote at, for example, some of the job fairs that colleagues have done, promotional leaflets about the youth contract. And of course the work programme providers themselves, I mean, this is a tool for them, and it's going to increase the likelihood of them getting young people into employment. And so they themselves are using this as a sales tool. But we are continuing to look for every opportunity we can to spread the word. But most fundamentally, the 350,000 employers who are on the Experian national database have all had notifications about it, which at least means we spread the word fairly widely. And if the trade bodies then reinforce that alongside the Chambers of Commerce, the CBI and others, hopefully we'll get to as many as possible. I'd love to say we get to everyone, but there isn't an easy way of doing so that is not extremely expensive.
And is there a way to make the message simple to employers? Because one of the other things we had was 33 different possible funding streams an employer could access when taking on a young person via apprenticeships or youth contract, and the complications of understanding that. Is there anything that can be done to sort of have a one-stop shop almost, a website you could go to that says these are the options available, click here to find it?
We're working on that now, and we have got, I mean, John and I work very closely together to try and make sure what we do is joined up. Frankly, what we discovered in the early weeks of the youth contract is that the points of interaction were not as good as they should be. We've done some mystery shopper work now ourselves to see how good or bad our points of contact are. We've learned some lessons, we're making improvements, and we are looking at simple single points of contact for people and try and simplify the messages.
If I might say, to Andrew Bigham, of course, he's going to be asking a section on this.
Sorry, I do apologise.
Forgive me, Chairman, I just wanted to, on that particular point, I'm conscious this committee has previously been understandably critical of joint departmental working and communications and so on and so forth. We have, I think it's fair to say, enjoyed an unprecedented level of cooperation, ministerial and official level.
We actually talk to each other, which is the useful slide.
It is actually becoming quite tedious. But I hear what you say about the joint marketing of this kind of initiative. We've also been encouraging small employers to take on a young apprentice and ensuring that consistent messages are broadcast is something we're aware of. And I think we might look at afresh as a result of your inquiry.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask one first, if I may, and then, I mean, if you were to undershoot on your wage incentives and there was part of the budget there left, would you be able to reallocate it to other parts of the youth contract?
Yes, yeah. There's no constraint on doing that.
Yes, it's Glenda, and then we're on
Do you
to
undertake a secret
Teresa.
shopper on the quality of the employer?
What, for the recruitment?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
if they sign up, does somebody actually check that, they're... You've made very clear you don't admire the possible exploitation of young people.
But the point about these are real jobs. This is not a kind of artificial placement. This is somebody who is being hired for a long-term position where the payment isn't made for 6 months. So no, we don't, any more than we would do mystery shopper work on anyone who hired a young person through Job Centre Plus. It would be totally unrealistic to do that. We would clearly check if we were funding a placement that was short-term, a training place or whatever, then there are mechanisms to inspect. But no, this is an incentive for an employer to hire someone.
now we've got Teresa on value for money.
Just on the points that were just raised, I just wondered, one of the things that we have heard is from employers, it's confusing and they're not sure which schemes they're eligible for and which they're not. Do you think local authorities, I know that local authorities are pushed, but if local authorities had somebody in the local authority that could sort of be a sort of fund finder for local business, that's something that could save them in the long run, with improving business, getting people into work. Do you think that would be something that local authorities could do and would want to do?
Well, John, you might want to, because a lot of the funding issues, I mean, if you look at the funding streams, I mean, actually from the point of view of employers, we have very few. Within the DWP, really the only financial support, the only financial incentives that come to an employer for hiring somebody come through the wage incentives in the youth contract, or potentially if a localised deal was reached with the work programme providers.
I think there was
a lot of it through the skills route.
There was some confusion over the apprenticeship.
I agree. I think local authorities have a part to play in this. Part of the city deals we've been putting together with the 8 principal cities include a skills offer. And I was in Liverpool a week or so ago, working with the Liverpool region. I might say so. My colleague Esther McVeigh has been very helpful in advising me on that, but also the Mayor of Liverpool, who I met when I went, and the Mayor of Knowsley too, who I also met. So there's a real engagement there with local authorities, and I think they can play a really important role in that as a conduit, both for people who want to get a job and get trained, and for employers, particularly bringing in the smaller employers. So we've developed this idea of apprenticeship hubs with a local authority, working with other agencies, working with authorities, principal local authority, working with other local authorities around it, which I was able to launch in Nottingham last year, and as I say, have helped shape up with cities across the country. But I think there's an argument of taking it more widely. I was talking to the Planning Minister, Greg Clark, who's been at the heart of this. I've been thinking about how we might take that to other kinds of local authorities beyond the conurbations. So I agree with you. I think local authorities can play a part in this.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Grayling, when you came to us in March, you told us that you decided to deliver wage incentives through the work programme to keep things as simple as possible. That's what you said. Wouldn't it be simpler just to give the money straight to the employer, the incentive, and actually leave out the work programme and the...
Oh, we do.
Oh,
the mechanism...
See, I told you it's complicated.
Yeah.
You do that as well.
The mechanism, and basically what happens is the work programme provider will help a young person find a job, and I'll say to the employer, right, you're entitled to the wage incentive. All the employer has to do is either after 8 weeks or 6 months, they print out, either from the work programme provider or from our website, a 2-page form, 2 sides of A4, and fill it out and send it to us. And that's all they have to do. It's as uncomplicated as that, and it's something the CBI have really welcomed, because normally in the past you've had about sort of 400 pages of complicated forms. It's literally got a name, address, name of employer, which work programme area you're in, and that's about it really.
But is it value for money? Because you're paying twice. You're paying the employer and you're also paying the work programme provider for outcome fees and sustainability payments.
Well, the work programme provider, of course, doesn't earn their fee in full for a young unemployed person until they've been in work for 18 months. So the job of the work programme provider is not only to find the initial opportunity, but also to support that young person through not just the first 6 months that are covered by the wage incentive, but actually take them through the full 18 months, by which point we hope that the young person is well bedded in their job, is well set on a career. So the work programme providers don't get anything like all of their fee at that point. They've got a much longer job than that.
But the work programme provider will get their fees if they sustain someone in work. But to be paying a wage incentive as well, it's a double payment for one person.
Well, but you're paying for different things. What we're doing, first of all, I mean, we've got this great challenge that too many jobs, in my view, too many jobs that could be going to young British school and college leavers are being taken by people who are coming to the UK from overseas. And my goal is to level the playing field. And it's that straightforward issue: do I hire the inexperienced young person or somebody who's 5 years older, who's got get up and go and has come across a continent to find work? And what I'm trying to do is level the playing field. So, and I think what I'm doing is paying for two things. What the wage subsidy is doing is it's levelling the playing field. It's actually saying to an employer, look, we know when you take on an inexperienced person, you have to invest more in them than you do if you take on somebody who's got a few years' experience. And therefore, what we're doing is contributing to that. In the case of the work programme provider, what I'm paying for is the employability development that Glenda Jackson was talking about earlier, the preparation to get into work through an interview. And these are people who have been out of work for many months or can come from very difficult backgrounds. You're trying to overcome the hurdles they face in getting into employment in the first place. You're getting them motivated, you're preparing them for the workplace, you're doing CV development, you're doing interview training, you may well be doing training development of that individual. Then once they're in work, you're paying actually to be the end of a phone, talking to them regularly, making sure they haven't developed problems in employment, making sure they're not likely to drop out. I'm paying for two different things. So yes, I fully admit we are paying for a more comprehensive service of support to get young people into work than we were previously, but I don't think I'm paying for the same thing twice.
When somebody's in that first 6 months with an employer, what obligation is there on the employer to actually give them training? I mean, they have to keep them for 6 months to get the money, but
yeah.
what other obligations are there?
Well, there is no obligation on the part of the employer, but they can't, unless that young person actually is there 6 months down the track, then the money isn't paid. So the obligation on the employer is no different to what it would be for any new employee. If you hire a new person, you want to induct them into your workplace, you want to train them how to do the job, that will certainly happen. Of course, if there's a longer-term training need, John, you might want to say a bit about the supported apprenticeships you have, because there are two options, the wage subsidy and also the supported apprenticeship.
But if you had an employer that took someone on, had them for 6 months, took the incentive at the end of 6 months, but they didn't actually invest in that person, would you not use that employer again? Or would that be up to the work programme? Well,
with the work programme provider, but frankly, if I was the work programme provider and I found a job for a young person and the employer basically did nothing with them for 6 months except get them to do menial jobs, at the end of 6 months said, thank you very much and goodbye, then I'd be pretty unimpressed because I wouldn't be getting my fee. So I think all the incentives are there for the work programme providers to try and find long-term employment, because that's how they maximise their return.
So when that person's in that job for 6 months, what ongoing in-work support would the work programme do, or would they just leave them there for 6 months?
Well, we have the black box approach to that. They can do whatever they want. I mean, what I would expect, what most of them do, is they have a dedicated team who are in regular contact with the employee, who are talking about what's going well and what's not. If issues arise in the workplace, they will talk to the employer and try and get those issues resolved. What's happening in quite a lot of cases now, which is, I think, very encouraging, what the work programme providers have worked out is if they can help get somebody moved on in work, that creates another vacancy they can fill. So if they can actually support somebody to the point of getting them promoted, then it creates another vacancy for another person to come along behind. So we're seeing actually some of them moving towards career development alongside that immediate back to work support.
We were possibly going to have the other Minister, John Hayes, on supported apprenticeships briefly.
That's most kind. I think perhaps important to, I speak among experts here, of course. You were former Social Security Minister and obviously spoke on this, and we've got former employers and teachers and all kinds of counsellors and all kinds of experts in the room. But I think it's important to set this in context, and we're seeing a fundamental structural change in our economy, and that structural change is about fewer unskilled jobs, and therefore to get a job without skills is becoming increasingly difficult, and that's why we focused so heavily on skills. That many of the young people working talking about might have been absorbed into the economy 20, 30, certainly 40 years ago, but simply won't now because those opportunities for unskilled jobs are not there. So part of boosting apprenticeships and focusing on young people is about equipping them, regardless of where they start, with the skills that make them most likely to get a job. And the supported apprenticeships really are about targeting SMEs in particular and trying to persuade them to take on a young person. Now, there are real and perceived risks for a small business taking on a very young person. I'm sure we'd all acknowledge that. We want to help as much as we can. What I'm looking at the moment is whether we need to do more. It may be the criteria we've set. We've said, for example, that someone can't take the support that we're offering, £1,500, if they've had an apprentice in the last 3 years. That may be too onerous, and maybe we've narrowed the target too much in those terms. And also, I want to look at the success of this. I want to look at whether £1,500 is sufficient, whether it's better to aim at a smaller number than the 40,000, but go for a bigger amount. You know, better to get 20,000, 10,000 if you like, if there are numbers required, than not hit the target on the basis of offering a smaller amount. I want to get this right by looking at it closely over the first 9 to 12 months and adjusting it to suit, so we get maximum opportunity for young people to get jobs with small employers.
I think what we'll do is, if we finish Teresa's section, and then we're on to Harriet anyway next, and so you'll be able to come in at that point. If that's okay.
Just that basically, Community Links told us that it wasn't utilising the wage incentives very much, but was concentrating on making its work programme participants as employable as possible by building good relationships with local employers, but not actually using the wage incentive. When you designed this scheme, did you consider whether money allocated for wage incentives would be better spent on more intensive one-to-one support, either from the Job Centre Plus or work programme providers? What made you think that work incentives was the way forward?
Well, I think if you look at the work programme, we had already established the contractual framework. We had the organisations involved signed up to a payment by results regime. We would not have wanted at that point to simply put extra money into the work programme. They have all signed up in the belief that they can deliver a good flow of people back into the workplace, and I intend to hold them to that. Where I accept that there was an issue, and the wage incentive really came in part from representations from different business groups who are all basically saying, look, we want to do something about youth unemployment, but there is this cost challenge that when you take on somebody without previous experience, you are putting a significant effort in yourself, and there's a financial cost and a time cost. And what we would like to see is a wage incentive structure that recognises that. And that was really, that's where the root came from. I think simply putting more money into the work programme, for example, or more money into Job Centre Plus for what we're already doing, would not have potentially made the difference that actually incentivising employers would do, levelling the playing field. Ian, so you've been left out of this. Do you want to say something a bit about wage incentives in principle?
Yes, I mean, firstly, just to say, I mean, in terms of the amount of money under the youth contract, I mean, between 1 and 200 million went to extra advisor time for Job Centre Plus. We had some discussions early on about extra signing, but perhaps important to note that there's also funding for just general, more, in-depth advisor time. And obviously you've got to come to a view as to kind of like how much it's worth putting into that that's still going to be cost effective. In terms of the wage incentives, I mean, we've had some discussions about it already. I think what the evidence would show is that, some of the kind of like cost effectiveness of wage incentives is varied, but the times when it's likely most effective is if it's focused on clearly defined disadvantaged groups, if it's done at a time of low labour market demand, and if it's made as simple as possible. Now, I think you need those three things in place to give it the best chance. In terms of low labour demand, well, we know it's still quite a tough environment out there, as opposed to the point the Minister's saying about people taking young people on. Secondly, we put it through the work programme so that employers taking someone on from the work programme would already know that they're relatively disadvantaged by the very fact that they were on the work programme. So sometimes the issues you might get around stigma, for example, about an employer thinking, well, I'm not going to take on someone with a wage incentive because that shows me that they're already a quite difficult claim to take on. Well, that was, we weren't adding to that because that was already known, and we were focusing on the more disadvantaged. So generally speaking, if you were with Job Centre Plus, you've been claiming for a relatively short period of time, maybe more easy to get into work. By the time you got to the work programme, more challenging and more of a case for giving that employer the extra push. And then the third element around marketing and simplicity. Again, the Minister's mentioned we work quite a lot with employers to try and keep the process as simple as possible. And I think with the communications, all we can say is we've started that process, and I just think we, as well as work programme providers, need to continue that as far as possible. If after all of that, further down the line we find that not all the wage incentives are being used, and obviously we can review the matter. But that was sort of the thinking early on.
I mean, that actually brings us to Harriet's questions, which are about that group who are in the greatest need and their role with wage incentives. So I don't know if you'd like.
Yes, and just a little niggly question that came up when Teresa was asking about a lot of these small businesses will be family businesses, and is there any barrier or rule against hiring your own child or your own young person?
Well, I mean, actually, the answer is no, there isn't, but they would have had to be out of work for 9 months first.
Yeah.
Attending Job Centre Plus on a fortnightly basis, demonstrably looking for jobs elsewhere, would then have to be registered for the work programme. So, I mean, in theory, it would be possible, but it seems unlikely.
Not likely to happen.
It's not. I mean, I wouldn't want to legislate for something that might happen in a tiny number of cases. I think it's very unlikely.
So, turning to the sort of areas and individuals with greatest need, we just were curious to know why it's a flat rate across the country and why there was no particular variation in terms of the payments for areas where clearly youth unemployment is higher.
Simplicity. The problem with something like this is, as I've learned on more than one occasion since becoming a minister, the more complicated something becomes, the more difficult it is to bed it into DWP systems and the longer it takes. The joy of this was it was very simple, it's easy to explain, flat payment, £2,275, payable after 6 months. You fill in a 2-page form to get it. If you're a small business, you can get an interim payment after 8 weeks. You fill in another 2-page form to get it. And so it was about simplicity and deliverability quickly.
Having said that, you then almost immediately made the change that Job Centre Plus could offer this to those who've been out of work for 6 months. So there was an almost immediate variation.
It was something that Job Centre Plus staff had been very keen to do. It seemed sensible in a small number of areas where there was a particularly acute problem to allow them to deploy it earlier.
If you saw, though, that the take-up was happening in areas with reasonably buoyant labour markets and that you were getting very disappointing levels of take-up in places where there are high pockets of youth unemployment, would you adjust your view?
We would certainly. I mean, I think the whole point about sensible government is you adapt to circumstance. And yes, of course, if we were finding that we were spending the money in the wrong places, of course we would consider whether there was a way to do it differently.
And how quickly do you think you'd be able to make that change and, and inform the payments in a regional
I mean, the obvious way to do it would be to replicate what we've just done with the hotspot areas. And that can be done very quickly.
In terms, Chairman, of the specifics of call for apprenticeships in that respect, as I said, I need to review the implementation of this to ensure that we're achieving what we aim. And I'm very happy to look at a whole range of proposals of how we might target this more effectively. Chris is right. We have to be careful about bureaucracy and so on. But nonetheless, it seems to me if you're going to review something on the basis of evidence, you want to use that evidence to adjust what you do. And I'm certainly going to do that in respect of the support we're giving to small employers on young apprentices.
I think Brendan Jackson wants to come in briefly.
On this reasonable issue, I mean, there is a growing movement for regional variations as far as wages are concerned. Is this going to impact on this scheme in any way if it really takes off? I mean, as far as affording apprenticeships are concerned, is there going to be any kind of...
Well, of course, the apprenticeship wage is a statutory wage, and indeed I've introduced statutory
I
conditions.
appreciate that.
But you're right to point out, Glenda, that most firms pay more than the statutory wage, and of course that varies from place to place, company to company, sector to sector. So I have no doubt the apprenticeship wage will reflect regional and local wage differences, because it is a job with a wage. It's bound to do so.
But it's not going to affect your contribution to that? Government's
No, our
funding?
contribution will be
That's
standard.
going to stay the same?
Our contribution will be standard, yeah.
Thank you.
Turning to young people who have the additional barrier of disabilities, again, we've received evidence that that there might need to be higher cash incentives to reflect those additional barriers. And again, is that something that you're likely to want to review at some stage?
Well, it's something. I mean, we're looking at that quite carefully. Maria Miller is looking quite closely at what else we might do. Of course, within the work programme, there is a higher price paid to help people with disabilities into work anyway. In most cases, either on ESA or former IB claimants. But it's something certainly we are considering.
And the Access to Work programme, is that well known for employers?
It's not as well known as it should be, and again, Maria is making an effort to build awareness of that. We see access to work as a very important part of what we do. One part of the changes taking place at the moment to disability support. There's been a lot of debate about the changes taking place within Remploy, and I would stress again that we are not reducing the support that is provided to people with disabilities in relation to employment. We are simply redeploying money from one place to another, and that includes an increase in the financial support of access to work.
And do we know, out of the 17,000 young people who have so far been announced to have found work, do we know whether there's any noticeable regional pattern there, or whether any of them are disabled?
Not yet, I'm afraid. This is very much the first pass. It was about the first piece of data we could gather. It was very much a question of phoning them up and saying, give us the latest management information. We will be able to dissect that in due course.
So if we check back in 6 months, do you think
we would be able to give more of a breakdown
granularity in terms of that data?
Yeah.
And then with the unemployment rate amongst young black men running at over 50%, I wondered whether you're considering further measures to tackle that issue in the youth contract.
What we're doing is that, I think that the first thing to say, which I think is quite important, is that there are pockets of high black and ethnic minority unemployment. But in most areas, actually that is a slightly misleading situation, because the proportion of people in the local population who are from black and ethnic minority ethnic groups is also much higher. So it's what may appear to be a disproportionately high level, a very disproportionately high level, is clearly significant, but it's not as out of kilter with the white community as would perhaps at first point appears to be the case.
But Runnymede Trust say that 55% of economically active black men aged 16 to 24 are unemployed. Does that number
the unemployment rate for young black men is around about 50%, I think, the most recent information, which is, it is quite a lot higher than the overall for young people, which is about 20-21%. I think just building on what the Minister said, I think some of this is down to the fact of characteristics that young black men might have. So, for example, on the whole, and they have lower levels of qualifications, and lower levels of qualifications are associated with higher unemployment rates. Where they live in the country can also impact on their unemployment rate. So there are a variety of factors that are affecting it. I mean, the general approach is to have support for ethnic minorities, black people, mainstreamed, I think we discussed before, mainstreamed through different interventions, and just in the same way as we have like flexibility in the work programme and within Jobs Centre Plus, we would expect them to set up particular types of support measures if they felt it was appropriate in
I
the
mean,
local
there's some
area.
very good work being done. If you look at, for example, what's being done in North London and around the Tottenham area, there are some very significant projects taking place on the ground, partnerships between Job Centre Plus and, for example, organisations like the Tottenham Hotspur Foundation looking to engage young black men who have a higher propensity to be unemployed. The point I was making about the numbers is quite often we have quoted parts of the country where there's a very high percentage of black and minority ethnic groups who are unemployed. What the comparators tend not to do is say, but what proportion of the overall population do those groups must make up? Because clearly, if 60% of the local population is black and minority ethnic, then there will be a higher proportion or a higher number of those people who are unemployed than an area where that's less the case.
I don't think that's what the statistic that I quoted was illustrating.
But we are working very hard, and what we've done, and the approach we've taken with Job Centre Plus has been to say we will do less at the centre, we will prescribe less, we will give you greater flexibility on the ground. Through the Flexible Support Fund, we'll give you greater financial flexibility on the ground. And what that means is that in areas like Tottenham, the Job Centre Plus staff have much more flexibility to tailor local projects, to support local projects, to form local partnerships that can target individual groups like young unemployed black men.
But that flexibility doesn't run to the wage incentive. That's all we're trying to ask about.
No, it doesn't. But of course, the wage incentive is available through the work programme to any unemployed young black man.
We'll just bring in the Minister,
yes,
John
Minister
Hayes,
sorry.
and then a quick one from Glenda, and then we're on to the NEET.
I agree with you, Harriet. I think it is extraordinary that when half of young male black Britons are unemployed, we import migrant labour from lands of which we know little. I think that is extraordinary. And certainly from my part on apprenticeships, where the record has not been great historically on minorities, frankly, I commissioned the National Apprenticeship Service to do specific pilot work on this. I'm very pleased to say that I learnt from them very recently that the group that I described to Glenda, the 5,000 that we brought in on access to apprenticeships, have a greater proportion of people from minorities than any previous work that they've done. So we are beginning to tackle this, but we've got a big mountain to climb. And on disability, I've got an answer here from my civil servants, which says that making significant inroads into the gap between disability employment and non-disability employment will not be achieved by specialist programmes alone. Well, fair enough, but I don't entirely agree with that. I think you do need some specialist approaches on this, and I think, again, there's not been sufficient work done on this in the past, and I think we need to do more. Disabled people deserve their chance to prosper on the basis of their ability, and I think we should go the extra mile. So I shall be going back telling them I don't wholly agree with this advice, and I shall be asking them to do more.
Quick one.
It is worth saying that there is a greater propensity amongst young people from ethnic minorities to be in education than amongst the white community. Those who are not in employment are more likely to be in full-time education than their white counterparts.
My question was based on your response that there were schemes that were working in this particular area. I think you said Tottenham, didn't you?
Yes.
Are you disseminating this information to the other hotspots around the country? And is the government paying for that information?
Well, I mean, it's not so much about disseminating information. What we're trying to do is precisely not do that. What we're trying to do is with our Job Centre Plus staff is to say, look, what we want to do is to give you the freedom to adapt what you think works for the needs of your local community. Now, of course, they share experiences because we have management conferences in Job Centre Plus that do precisely that, share what's working well compared with one area or another. But what we're not trying to do is say you should do this. What we're trying to do is to empower the frontline staff to take decisions about what will work best in their areas. And in some areas, that will mean creating programs for redundant 50-something executives. In other areas, it will mean creating programs for young black unemployed people. And the whole point about providing flexibility at the front line is that the individual local Job Centre Plus teams have both the flexibility and the financial support to be able to tailor programs to what is needed in their areas.
No, but this question was specifically about the 50% of young black males who are not working. And my question was, if you're seeing Job Centre Plus flexibility in one area, producing very good results in that particular part of the population, is that being disseminated to all Job Centre Plus? Well, it won't be all Job Centre Plus, but you know the hotspots. But that
is precisely why Job Centre Plus has regular communication between all of its leadership to talk about what's working and what's not working and things that they're doing, things they could do.
Yeah, but we all know it never gets from the boardroom to the shop floor, so how are you following that up?
Well, you say it never gets to the boardroom to the shop floor, but this is actually involving managers of job centres.
And I think we saw quite a good scheme at the Prince's Trust. But I think we're now on to the NEAT programme, Harriet.
Well, just very quickly on the 16 to 17-year-olds, and we were hoping that Tim Lawton would be here.
Yeah.
So we do understand that it's, I think, his department, isn't it, that's going to put out the contracts for the 16 to
Yes,
17-year-olds?
I'm in the DFE as well, and I
Brilliant.
have a brief. It is Tim's responsibility, but I will give him my best shot, Chairman.
When are we going
Thank
to
you.
hear where the contracts are going now?
Well, I understand that the answer to that is imminently.
I know, imminently for a while. Yes.
Well, I can do all kinds of things as I'm in the hot seat, can't I? And I will take back that to DFE and let this committee know exactly what imminently means.
Okay, great. And we've heard evidence on the 16 to 17-year-old programme. It's going to focus on those leaving education with no GCSEs.
Yes, the aim is to pick up those with low or no qualifications, certainly sub-GCSE qualifications. They're very much the group we've been talking about earlier, who as a result of that are less likely to get into progressive learning or work. This is targeted at them, designed to get them in education, employment or training, and the focus of the programme is very much building on the work programme approach, is to tailor the product that's best suited to their needs.
But we've heard that the amount in the contract is probably only going to be about £1,500 after things like VAT have been deducted, and we have heard evidence that that's not necessarily going to be enough.
It's 126 million, as you know. Well, I think that has to be measured on after analysing effect, doesn't it? I mean, we can't start with assumption it's not enough. We need to measure its effectiveness, as I said about my own work in apprenticeships. Now, I think it will vary according to how far those people are from the labour market, what their prior attainment's like. But my judgment about that is that there are many people who, with incremental additional support, can get to the point where they're likely to either get into progressive learning or work. That's not, however, a reason to avoid the hard-to-reach cases. You may well be right that something additional is needed in respect of the people who are furthest from the labour market.
And it's a national contract, and rather than the regional packets that the work programme had. But one of the concerns we've heard about the work programme generally is that not enough money was flowing down to perhaps some of the voluntary sector organisations, and we just wondered why you would want to model it on the work programme with the prime provider, where you might want to directly give the contracts to some of these.
That's partly about the voluntary sector organisations as employers, and I had a meeting with them, with a group of them, specifically to talk about their role in both delivery, but also their role as employers and as trainers themselves, of course. So you're absolutely right that the engagement with the third sector is important, and some of the best work that's done with the hardest to reach groups is done by the voluntary sector. We certainly wouldn't want a vanilla flavour approach that didn't take account of their expertise. As I said, bear in mind this is about 16, 17-year-olds, and I spoke about the hardest to reach, the furthest, the people furthest away. I'm not excluding work with those other older people who are outside the workplace. This is very much targeted at very young people who I think with that incremental support can get to where they need to be.
Can I just add on that? I mean, essentially, the group that's covered by this programme, if you look at the 16 to 18 NEAT figures, there's a fairly big number in overall headline terms, but when you actually strip that down, there's only a relatively small number, a few tens of thousands, who are NEAT for any length of time.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that this really focuses on. Of course, one of the challenges is these are people who don't come in to the benefit system mostly. A few do, but most don't. So it's a different kind of exercise to the work programme. We can't mandate people to this. It's got to be delivered much more clearly on the ground. And one of the things that we talked through in the initial commissioning of this was it actually also probably needed to be different to the work programme in presentational terms as well if it was going to be to work in engaging those young people. And so it is more localised, the amounts of money are smaller, the contracts are smaller, it's easier for voluntary sector groups to come in and operate on a payment by results basis, given the size of the contracts. And I would question, I know there's some noise in and around the work programme around money getting to the front line, but the truth is today there are something like 200,000, a rough estimate, about 200,000 people in the work programme are being supported by the voluntary sector. And there are lots of voluntary sector organisations that are happy and satisfied with progress. Those that have tended to complain are those that have not had the degree of work to which they were hoping.
Yeah. Can I just ask one more question on this
we're
topic,
running
please,
short,
Chair?
but we've got 2 more sections to go, and
So we've had
quarter of an hour.
conflicting evidence on this particular thing, because the estimate is that this money will cover 54,000 people over 2 years. But we've had some people say that because they're so hard to find and identify, some of the money will go to waste. And then we've had other people say that it really should be extended to cover the person who was 17 last summer and didn't get any GCSEs but will perhaps be 18 by the time these contracts are awarded, and it should also be extended to cover those who perhaps are single parents who have never had any qualifications and that ought to be wider. So how
but those
rigid are you going to
the
be with
18-year-olds
these
would go into the work programme anyway. The moment they're on benefits, they would go into the work programme. I mean, I think what I would say, we had all of this around the contracting of the work programme as well. There's always lots of chatter about, well, it's not enough money and it could be done like this, could be done like that. At the end of the day, they all bid, and they're putting their own money on the table. And that's the joy of payment by results, because if they weren't happy with the approach that we were taking, or didn't think they could work with it, they wouldn't put their own money on the table to operate payment by results.
That in this targeted piece of work, and as I say, we'll clearly review its effect. I think it's premature to say this is insufficient to achieve.
But do you want it to be oversubscribed or undersubscribed?
Well, I can think of no better group than this committee to separate that paradox from that conundrum.
But there's
plenty
plenty
for me to second guess your deliberations about the evidence that you've been presented.
There are plenty of bids there. I mean, there's no shortage of organisations that want to do it, that's for sure.
And I think if Brandon can ask his questions in about 6 minutes, we'll get Andrew in to just finally finish it off.
I'm particularly interested. I had a meeting today with some LEPs, and a comment came from the LEP that there's a real focus on needs and a lot of political drive to deal with needs. When they'd actually analysed an area, they'd hit on the point you just raised, which is actually the number of those who really need help is actually a very, very small percentage. I'm therefore interested, in terms of, for example, over this summer period we're going into, a lot of sort of finished school, not yet, we don't necessarily know what they're doing in September. What comments have we got, or what is being done to make sure that local authorities are able to keep account of them, to know who they are, where they are, without overly making this bureaucratic, and be able to get to the right people to make sure they're getting the support they need without wasting time and money on those who don't need it, to be blunt?
It's very difficult because they're not people who come. These young people are not necessarily people who come within the ambit of the welfare state. They may show up through the troubled families work. One of the things that we have clearly said to the providers in the 16 to 17 package is that they will need to go out and recruit and identify. It is a difficult age group to work with because they're not in the benefit system, and because local authorities have got a reasonable idea who they are, and certainly the providers will need to work with local authorities. But
don't get local authorities retain the statutory duty to ensure that people participate.
Yeah.
So there is, as Teresa argued earlier, there is a perfectly reasonable tie-up with local authorities in the identification and then the allocation of resources to target that group.
So there is, just to clarify, there's a statutory requirement for local authority. There's also an incentive for the providers to actually get in and deal with that anyway.
Well, if they don't recruit, they won't be able to earn any money.
Yeah, so that's fine. In terms of, one of we touched on a few different areas today, is the proliferation of funding streams, groups, organisations, and different schemes. I had somebody today talk about it's 33 or 40 for a particular this age group. In that sense, what can be done, or is there a need to do anything to simplify it so that businesses who want to be involved and can offer apprenticeships or whatever else can do it simply, easily and understand it, instead of being scared off by a wall of bureaucracy and funding streams. But equally for 16 to 17-year-olds to understand it, Does it need to be simplified, or is there one body in the middle that can do that for them, if you like? Or is there work or things more we can do to just make that simpler? So eventually we get to a point where an employer can shake hands effectively, use a phrase we heard the other week, with the employee and get on with it.
Well, I did mention earlier, I talked at some length indeed about the National Career Service that we've put into place. One of the things I missioned that service to do is to insinuate itself into those communities where some of the challenges are greatest. I want it to have a reach through housing associations, through community vehicles, through public libraries, through all kinds of different village halls, to all kinds of different communities and sections of communities. So getting the word out, as you suggest, is partly about reach, isn't it? And I think the National Career Service has a job to do in that respect. Because don't forget, that'll be about advising people not just on jobs, but on training, on re-engagement, on enhancing their capabilities so they might get into the labour market. But Tris is right, in a sense, the more challenging, the more difficult it is both to identify people, to get them back on the road to learning and work, to tailor a package suitable for them. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's a significant challenge for any government.
So, to use an example particularly pertinent to this group, we've got the Big Lottery Fund with its talent match programme that's just launched, obviously EFA. Do you see those as complementary, or are there things that need to be done to make sure they don't become almost competitive with each other?
I have to say that the Big Lottery Fund caught us by surprise. They didn't talk to us first. I think it's a shame they didn't. Because there is a danger. I mean, the reality is that there are lots of people and lots of organisations in the welfare to work arena. Before we came along, the DWP actually had contracts with 1,200 organisations to provide welfare to work related services. We've reduced that quite substantially, but it's still probably more than we should have. It's not entirely clear to me how the Big Lottery Fund is going to avoid duplicating what we're already doing. And I think that is a risk. There's lots of people who want to do the right thing, and I admire them for doing that, but there's no point us all doing the same thing twice. And the reality is every unemployed young person who has been out of work for more than 9 months, or 3 months if they come from a difficult background, for example, having previously been NEET, will be on the work programme. So anything anybody else is doing needs to complement or work alongside. If it doesn't, it just duplicates.
And I think finally we've got Andrew Bingham.
Right, thank you, Chairman.
Would quick.
It will have to be.
A young person who is markedly will find anything with the National Lottery in it far more attractive than Job Centre Plus or College of Further Education. We know there's extreme difficulty in getting hold of all the needs. Could it not be that the lottery fund could have the magic?
Well, if you're talking about 16 to 17-year-olds, yes, but of course if they're on job seekers allowance, they're subject to conditionality. We can't leave them to choose. They have to have,
We've already said that a lot of these young people don't come onto the benefit system at all.
Well, before the age of 18, that's certainly the case.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for being late. The contract was announced by the Deputy Prime Minister. Today we have ministers from 3 different departments. I mean, that illustrates how it cuts across so many departments. Do you think does that demonstrate how difficult it is? Because it seems to me it's such a big issue that it just cuts across so many different...
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister has a different role in all of this, of course. I mean, the truth is it predominantly fits between our 2 departments. The 16 to 17-year-olds have been, the programme has been jointly commissioned between the DWP and DFE. So we've had 2 teams working together on that. John and I work very closely together, and yes, we have got different departments, and you can make an argument for saying, well, skills should be moved in to sit alongside employment. But we are where we are, and departmental reorganisations are hugely disruptive. So frankly, I think it's better to have 2 ministers working closely together and just able to pick the phone up to each other and say, what about this, than trying to do departmental reorganisations.
But I can see which one I'm your boss. I can see that.
Oh, absolutely, John.
Yeah, you're right, of course, that the challenge is that the risk is duplication or complication.
It is a case for a single youth unemployment agency.
tell you why I wouldn't do that at the moment. I think Chris is right. Department of Rural Associations are always difficult, costly, and it would interrupt some of the progress that we're achieving at the moment. What we've tried to do is to create sufficient overlap between what we do around adding additional coherence. We've got a joint ministerial advisory group. Our civil servants work very closely. We meet with alarming regularity to ensure absolute consistency between what we're doing. Now, frankly, our functions are rather different, but the reason they're so closely linked is a reason I gave earlier, that in order to get people into work, very often they need to acquire skills and learning. And my job is to give them that. So the absolute clarity with which we're working together, I think, does overcome some of the potential risks of contradiction that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, you've probably answered the next question I was going to ask. I'm sure colleagues like I have had quite a few emails from constituents asking for a single older persons minister. Do you think, and I think you partly answered it really, but what would your views about letting your responsibilities on that go to a single youth and unemployment and skills minister?
Effectively, I am the youth unemployment minister. But most fundamentally, but I'm not exclusively young employed people. My job is to make sure that we deliver the best possible support to all unemployed people. Now, if you took a slice of my job away and gave it to somebody else, how would you then, who would be responsible for the work programme, for example? Would it be them? Would it be me? I think segregating by age makes no sense. I think, youth unemployment is a big issue. The two groups that we've got the biggest problem with are young people between 18 and 24 and people over the age of 50. Splitting those into two halves and having somebody responsible for each I think, fragments the support we provide.
You've heard it with silo mentality.
So this is an area where the Cabinet Office is also involved with the Deputy Prime Minister with an overseeing role.
It doesn't really have an overseeing role. He stirs some pots, but he doesn't. They don't have an operational involvement. He has the kind of stirring pot role that the Prime Minister does, and wanting to set a strategic direction.
But having said that, I think where you're right, Chairman, is that it is important that someone apart from us, frankly, as well as with us, does the business of brainstorming, does the business of the creative thinking, encourages us to review and calibrate policy. And there is a role there at Cabinet Office, and there's a role for number 10. And of course, we do work closely with them along those lines.
Yeah, so this is a very important priority for the government.
Precisely, an absolute fundamental priority.
Well, can I thank you both?
Could I, Chairman, just before
Yes,
you wrap, could I just make one point to the committee, which we haven't touched on before, which I think is very helpful to know and understand. There is a lot of chatter around at the moment about trends in youth unemployment, both trends in long-term youth unemployment and about the absolute numbers of young unemployed people. And I just wanted to clarify a couple of points for the committee. The first is that there has been no significant increase in long-term youth unemployment in the last 2 years. What has happened in the past 2 years, and we keep reading that there has been, it is not the case. What has happened in the last 2 years has been a series of policy changes have impacted upon the way the figures actually appear. And the best example of why that's the case, in the past, under the previous government, when in fact, not just a young person, but any unemployed person, moved into a New Deal programme or similar, they were moved for a period of time onto a training allowance. That removed them from the JSA figures. And when they came back onto JSA after a period of time, they went back to being a day one claim. And so it is a statistical nuance. Those people were, of course, still unemployed. They were just on a training allowance. They're still unemployed for a lengthy period of time, but they did not show up in the statistics. We don't do that anymore. And so one of the things that the committee should be aware of in its considerations is that talk about a significant increase in long-term youth unemployment is not accurate. That there has been no such increase.
Do you have figures? Are there any published statistics on this?
There is a paper available in the House of Commons library, which you'll see the exact calculation that's been done by our statisticians, free of political interference, I should say.
Has it got a link or
we can certainly make that available.
Perhaps if you write to the committee, and we'll have
we'll do that.
spread it around. I mean, I suppose the other very significant factor is the participation in education, because obviously when I was a young person, very few people went on to university, and now it's a very high percentage, and of course all of them are included in the ILO
Absolutely,
measure.
yes, which is very unfortunate.
Now, I haven't cut you short, have I? Because I think...
Well, the other point, very briefly to make, I will also send the committee the calculation of the impact of other policy changes, because of course, under the previous government, a number of young people were in the Future Jobs Fund and did not therefore show up in the youth unemployment figures while they were there, even though they were in government-funded placements of a temporary nature. And that also has had a measurable impact on the actual level of young people who did or didn't have jobs. So we'll make available, if I may, some statistical details to the committee about the true changes in youth unemployment over the last couple of years that may be of value to it.
Mr. Heald,
yes, of course.
I wouldn't want to be trumped by my colleague in making an incisive final point. So I think just to pick up your point on participation, absolutely accurate point. It would be perhaps useful if we just drop the committee a line on the trend in participation, which shows growing levels of participation up to more than 93%, and takes into account both the factor you raised and the greater engagement of people in work-based training. So I'll be more than happy to make that information available alongside what my honourable friend has said he will.
Is there any subdividing in those figures?
Sorry.
Are there any subdivisions within those figures?
Yes,
Specific
there are.
Categories of young
I'll break it down for you.
Thank you.
The information I'll provide.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think we'd all agree that youth unemployment is nonetheless a concerning thing, and running at levels which are high and needs tackling. And so I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. It's been very helpful to the committee, and we'll have to think what we say in our report. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.